Modern medicine is great at what it's built for. It's built for acute care. But if you're dealing with a chronic metabolic disease, the system is not built for that. It's not that it's even failing. It's that it wasn't built for that in the first place. It doesn't matter how you've been trained. When you become desperate enough, you'll try anything. And so I stumbled upon trying a ketogenic diet. To my surprise, it worked. So when you have a personal experience like that, you ask different questions, you see things differently. But my dad always taught me, stay curious. If you ask a question and you don't get a good answer, keep asking the question. And if people don't give you a good answer and they get angry at you for asking the question, it probably means you're asking a great question. Rather than looking at your healthcare provider as the source of truth and some omniscient being, seeing them as they should be seen, which is as your support, your partner with you in control.
If Nick Norwitz could change our medical education, what would he do?
That's a difficult question. I mean, there's a lot of things I would do.
It's a pleasure to meet you, my brother.
Pleasure to meet you.
How you doing?
Good.
All right. All right. Where are you in this world?
Boston.
Boston.
Boston. So
Boston.
Yeah, Boston, born and bred. I've bounced around the world, but I always end up back in Boston.
Awesome. It's a great place. We did a meet up there not too long ago. And I'm a kid from LA. I live in upstate New York. And but I go back and forth a little bit. And it's really spectacular to have you here. And so many people have been watching your amazing energy and healing ideas, which is non-standard. And I'm just curious about, one is, why did you go into medicine in the first place? And what inspires you every day to sort of buck the system?
Yeah, honestly, both answers have to do with my family. So why I went into medicine, I mean, it's vanilla, but it was the family business. I grew up in a family of physicians. Both my parents are not only MDs, but MD PhDs, so academic physicians. My brother is in medicine. My sister is in medicine. We're all in medicine. So it's one of those things that it was just, I always loved science. I truly love biology. And I had this very utopic, if that's even a word, I'm thinking of utopia, but this ideal of medicine as this is a place that I can explore the biological realm. I can explore my curiosity as I can explore nature through human physiology and help people. How amazing does that sound? So that's the picture I've had of medicine in my head. Now, as anybody who's actually gone into clinical medicine knows, that the ideal doesn't match reality. So my life kind of took a tangent as I was going through my graduate level training. So as I was finishing up college, I went to Dartmouth College, majored in cell biology and biochem. As I was finishing up there, I had a fellowship, a scholarship to go to Oxford to do a PhD, which gave me a little bit of time before starting med school. So I had a place at Harvard Medical School. And shit hit the fan, so to speak, actually literally, because I started to develop really bad gastrointestinal distress. And it wasn't your run-of-the-mill like IBS, my tummy hurts. It was inflammatory bowel disease, in my case, ulcerative colitis. So to give people a picture of what that is, because I know acronyms get confusing, IBS, IBD, they kind of meld together. But for me, it was like bloody diarrhea, uncontrollable, 12, 20 times a day. So coming from a place of being, a high-performing academic and athlete to having my academic life, my physical life as an athlete, and my social life, my mental health, all more corrupted is the right word, like obliterated by this condition. I mean, sobering, humbling, despair-inducing, choose your word. It was really a life moment for me. Now, I'll cut through the gory details. Obviously, I'm here and I'm fine. And the way I got here was through a path of desperation, experimentation, self-experimentation with things that were unconventional. Even though I had a very conventional mindset, it doesn't matter how you've been trained. When you become desperate enough, you'll try anything. And so I stumbled upon, trying a ketogenic diet. We can talk about how I got there, but long story short is, to my surprise, it worked. I went into remission, and I'm talking about biomarkers clinically and on biopsy. So it was a complete life reversal, a health reversal. And this happened during my PhD studies and before I started at medical school. But I already had the place to start at medical school. So that really was sobering, and it framed how I then went into my training. So when you have a personal experience like that, you ask different questions, you see things differently. And so as I went through finishing up my PhD, then my 4 years at Harvard Med, I just saw the world through that lens. I saw the world through the perspective of a suffering chronic disease patient. And seeing the world through that lens, irrespective of, the high regard I hold physicians in, and I do, I I couldn't not see the huge dysfunctions in the system and the fact that the system is not serving our needs. And so that led me to really, I think, ask the hard questions, which also brings me back to my family because I always grew up asking questions. I was always curious, like I said, and I thought I could explore that in like medicine and science. Turns out when you ask the wrong questions, you get in trouble. But my dad always taught me, stay curious. If you ask a question and you don't get a good answer, keep asking the question. And if people don't give you a good answer and they get angry at you for asking the question, it probably means you're asking a great question. He's a little bit of a troublemaker in and of himself, but that's really what drew me to where I am now. I had a personal experience. I've always been curious. I see healthcare as a place where we should be able to capitalize on curiosity for the betterment of human health. That's not actually the case, but that's not going to stop me from asking the questions that I think we need to ask to get the answers that we need and change the system in a way that we need to do in order to address this metabolic health epidemic. I'm sure I don't need to tell your audience about that.
So you obviously have a family history of medicine, MD, PhD, and much standard practice of medicine because most of us came from that. What are you finding what's wrong with standard medicine? Or
That's a
is there
big
something
question.
wrong with standard medicine?
So I like the way you asked the second part of the question. I would say modern medicine is great at what it's built for. It's built for acute care. You need a liver transplant, you're bleeding out, you need chemotherapy or you need to get like a rare cancer treated. The American healthcare system is pretty darn good. But if you're dealing with a chronic metabolic disease, the system is not built for that. It's not that it's even failing. It's that it wasn't built for that in the first place. The incentive structures that are built are not geared towards what are the patient's needs. It is built as a business. And so the incentive structures, and this is what I think the big problem is, focus the scope of medicine and care in directions that are guided by the business, the economics. And that doesn't mean there's any conspiracy theory. It doesn't mean that hospitals or big pharma is evil. It's the system we built. And I think just acknowledging that framework helps us understand why things aren't shifting to treat people's needs. Because we don't have a system that is built for preventative care. The incentive structures aren't built up to use metabolic health interventions to help address obesity, diabetes, mental health disorders. And another layer I will add with respect to this is, how the research is done and how certain things become standard of care. So let me elaborate. In order for something to become standard of care, it needs to check certain boxes on the hierarchy of evidence. It's kind of like imagined pyramid, how certain levels of evidence are considered better than others. Now, certain studies are just more expensive and technically harder to conduct. So if you want to do a double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled trial, that's expensive. It requires a lot of investment, and it's difficult to conduct. Now, if there's a business model wrapped around that, because you're going to get a drug that you can sell, pharma will pay for it because they're going to make money, not because they're evil. This is capitalism. It actually incentivizes them to innovate. In a way, it's a good thing. But take that framework now and ask the question, well, who's going to pay for the $10 million randomized control trial comparing a carnivore diet to a vegan diet for inflammatory bowel disease? Who makes money? That study's never been done. And so even if either of those diets, I have my own guesses, but even if either of those diets was like the most effective thing in the universe for Crohn's and colitis, inflammatory bowel disease, if the study hasn't been done, it can't be recommended as standard of care. So I use that example in particular because I was shocked when I went keto and my inflammatory bowel disease went into complete remission. I was stunned because I grew up in a conventional mindset and I'm like, but I can't point to any evidence-based RCT to say this will work. And that's the problem. The problem is the most effective interventions aren't necessarily the ones that are being recommended. The ones that are being recommended are the ones that have had the check boxes put next to them because there's a business model and incentive structure to do these studies. So that's the mismatch.
Is there science that has been randomized in the medical system and the doctors recommending a plant-based diet?
I mean, plant-based diets aren't my area of expertise, but
Well,
yes,
Mediterranean diet is a
in
plant
general, like,
diet. Did we come up with our recommendations? And can the doctors you're working with or have worked with cite you the studies of why they recommend the diets and the information they recommend to the patients?
okay, so that's a slightly different question. So are there RCTs on plant-based diets? Yes. There are also RCTs on keto and in most diets. The question of, can healthcare workers that are recommending these diets cite and, have in-depth conversation on the literature? From my experience, no. I won't name individuals, but I will say, like, I took electives in nutrition where I went to medical school, and I asked questions during these electives about the studies being presented, and I was not impressed by the presenters' understanding of the methodology and the studies they were presenting, or, the rationale behind the guidelines that were being proposed. And I do think that's a problem. I think a lot of the times what we do is we hand out platitudes that sound nice, but are entirely empty. Think about eat a balanced diet. What the heck does that even mean? It's a platitude. It's a hand-wavy statement. And, it allows us to defer responsibility onto the patient, the person trying to live and solve the problem, rather than actually giving useful physiology first, metabolism centric advice. So the short answer to your question is no. I don't think people generally recommending standard dietary approaches know the literature as a generalization. Of course, there are exceptions.
And I'm wondering, recently I was just discussing an idea. The leading cause of all disease is actually doctor recommended advice, which is,
I don't know that.
well, I'm just telling you from my experience and your experience with IBS, mine with that, and also kidney stones and bowel bleeding and many other things. Never did anyone ask me what I ate, and it was always a Mediterranean diet or diet doesn't matter. Yet when I went keto, I got better, and carnivore went away. And now I ask the question to all of us, if the advice we're giving isn't working, why are we so resistant to even try something different? What have you found in our medical system, how open we are to just simply, why are we waiting for a study when we have examples like yourself and myself and many others that are seeing a change? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I do think we need the study to change standard of care. Like, medicine and science are conservative, and on balance, that's a good thing. You can get too conservative, but you can't take anecdata, so to speak. I'm not going to say my conclusion here, to be clear, is not that these stories aren't important. I value my story a lot, but you can't use that for the standard of care. What you can do is see these accumulated clinical narratives and get curious and find a way to motivate and fund the studies to make it standard of care. So they're important. They're a signal. But I think, as I mentioned earlier, the nature of the beast is that we don't have a system that allows us to do what we need to do to transform what is recommended and what is standard of care. I will elaborate insofar as, you were pointing out, why do healthcare workers keep pushing, or I guess it's the perception,
Clinicians mostly
that don't work.
Yeah.
And what I would say is the answer is liability, or one answer is liability. Like, you are taught to recommend certain things that are in line with standard of care guidelines, and you will get in trouble for stepping out of line. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have an evidence-based better solution, what you're going to try to do is support people in the way that you know how, what you were trained with, what knowledge you have. And so it's not any given healthcare worker's fault if they don't have information and tools to support their patients. I was actually talking with, I don't know if you know Dr. Andrew Kutnick, amazing guy, PhD scientist, type 1 diabetic for going on probably 2 decades now. Wow. But we were talking about what he did for type 1 diabetes. He's actually been in perfect glycemic control now for like 12 years, which is unheard of with type 1. And what he did was, quote, against standard of care. He did a ketogenic diet for type 1. And in part of our discussion, we were talking about like what people, including dietitians, are trained in. And he shared with me a study, I think it was actually done in Canada, but that showed that 76% of dietitians had little or no training in the clinical utility of low carbohydrate diets. Now, at the individual level, that's not their fault. If it's not in the training program and they don't have the tools, it's just not any tools that they learned in school. But that fact is a gross systematic problem. 76% of dietitians don't know how to, clinically manage or prescribe a low carbohydrate diet. It's kind of appalling.
All right. If you're not a member of the Mighty Tribe yet, you must, right? Just go to Kiltz's Mighty Tribe and become a member. It's free. The whole intention is to bring the community of all humans to learn why this is better than this. And we invite all vegans and vegetarians, Mediterraneans, and carnivarians to Kiltz's Mighty Tribe. It's a meetup. It's a place to learn while you've been suffering likely from this and you'll feel better on this. But what are the nuances of what you can do to feel better, look better, and live better? Because I've done it. And that's why I created the Mighty Tribe, to bring you into the masterclass. Be the master, my friends, and join Kiltz's Mighty Tribe. God bless.
And so isn't it our responsibility to question what we're doing? And we keep on providing the standard of care, but the standard of care seems to be hurting us. And we went into medicine to help people. And if your experience is opposite of standard of care, isn't it our job in science and medicine because it's the one, do no harm, and our real job is to help the people in front of us, not the sort of the standard of care model that's been created. And what are your thoughts on ultimately, I went into medicine, you went into medicine, I'm sure, because
to help people.
Yeah. And like myself, I'm Mediterranean, Italian, and that was my lifestyle. And yet when I went carnivore, it all went away. Yeah. And then the science of that, because the science of this, and yet the most closed-minded group I've ever seen is the medical community.
Yeah. There are a few layers to this. I would say one is when we're talking about standard of care hurting people, I think we need some specificity. So what do we talk about? Like I said, there are a lot of things that Western medicine does great. And also sometimes standard of care helps, say, 70% of people for a given intervention and hurts 30. So the art of medicine is trying to figure out, well, what are the 30? And not give them that treatment and give them something else. The idea is bio-individuality. So you have an experience with a carnivore diet. I have an experience with a ketogenic diet. And I really value that inside my N=1 context. It does motivate me every single day. And it's something that, shapes the way I look at the literature. But I also need to remain aware that I am me. And my experience isn't necessarily generalized to other people. So seeing the individual in their context, figuring out what are their needs, diets, medication, and otherwise, without being dogmatic or too biased by our own perspectives, I think is important. So we can talk about specific interventions. There's a lot of talk about statins, GLP-1s, PC, like right now, lipid medications are a hot topic, and we can talk about why. And I bring that up because I think it's a good example of the complexity of cost-benefit analysis. But quickly, to respond to something else you said the medical community is closed-minded, or something to that effect.
In general.
I would say there's two sides to that. I would say in a public sphere where your audience will have observed the most vocal online conventionalists, yes. I think in the public sphere, people get very defensive. That's not necessarily how clinicians, or at least academic clinicians, behave amongst colleagues. So one of the very interesting things I found as I went through medical school was, if I'm online, yeah, you're right. The conventionalists are very conservative. They push back. They're very guarded. But then I'm walking around like the Harvard hospitals, and I'll have a conversation with a clinician, a senior resident or an attending. And when I come to them with interesting data, even if it butts, or especially if it butts against standard of care, the response is usually, oh, that's interesting. Let's have a conversation about that. Because in that setting, they can just talk to another intellectual. And I think there's less of a fear of, like giving an inch and having someone take a mile, so to speak, and do something dangerous. So I think in the public setting, clinicians get very conservative, but I don't think the base instinct is necessarily that. Or I guess another way to put it is, I think within most clinicians, most caring clinicians who presumably want to help their patients, they're open to having conversations about new data and learning. And so it's just about, like, you know, how to open that conversation, which is a lot easier to do in a one-on-one than scalably. So that's a whole other.
I've been reported to the New York State Medical Association, and my license was in jeopardy. And the hospitals, an academic center that I work at, warned me not to talk about this. And it's just an interesting world we live in standard medicine. And I was having a conversation with an internist, and, you know, they think this diet is absolutely ludicrous. Now, I focus mostly on carnivore. And I asked them, when was the last time you actually took a patient off a medication? And these are open-minded people, and they said pretty much never. And so we're disease managers, and that's kind of what standard medicine has come to. And that's why I'm curious on, you're in the ketogenic high-fat world, and GLP-1s and statins and all these fancy drugs are big out there. And I'm just, you know, our war against obesity, what's our cost for that? And 99% of people lose the war eventually. And that's the biggest challenge. And where do you see, and this is a good conversation, and there's no right answer here. We're looking for, you know, this conversation is, you know, where do GLP-1s and statins all fall into this world? Or is our continued advice for a standard diet really driving us all to a statin and a GLP-1?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is pharmacotherapy should be not necessarily, like, you should treat metabolic health diseases with metabolic health interventions, which first and foremost means lifestyle. Obesity, you can have a genetic predisposition. It's totally true, but it is a lifestyle disease. So to truly treat it, I do think you need, or you should have, a lifestyle intervention. So let's, you know, bucket these and talk about GLP-1s first. Does that mean I'm saying people shouldn't take GLP-1s? Absolutely not. They're a tool like any other, and it's about how the tool is used. So, you know, we know a little bit about how GLP-1s work. One thing they do in the brain, they act on the hypothalamus to quiet food noise. That idea of, like, food chatter, you know, that compulsion to eat. Now, if you think about that, and there are actually data on this, about how it quells more so than, like, ingestion satiety. So once you eat, it's not as much about getting full fast, but pre-ingestion satiety. Almost, again, that food noise, that drive to eat when it's presented to you. Different people have different levels of that. Now, it's not something I per se have struggled with. So it's not like in my scope of experience, but I can really imagine, you know, if you always have that draw, it can be really hard to, in the moment, make a good conscious decision. It's like, you know, to now draw a kind of weird analogy, like, you know, if you're from a fight with a family member or a loved one, like if I fight with my girlfriend, like, the moment of that heated energy, you never say the thing that you should have said if you stopped and think about it. And it's the same way with food choice. Like, if you have a high emotional moment, you're going to make bad choices. Now, what if we could give some compound that would quiet the food noise, bring down the emotional tone so you can make a smart decision? GLP-1 receptor agonists can do that. So if you pair them with smart lifestyle interventions, they're not the crutch. They're a catalyst for change, potentially, when used that way. So I am for them as a tool. I think that the science suggests that they have a lot of benefits, even independent of obesity. They can have weight-independent effects on the brain that are quite good. We can talk about the mechanisms for that. So I'm pro them in that sense. What I'm against, and I think probably a lot of your audience, if I'm guessing correctly, is also against, is not GLP-1s per se, but the idea that this is the magic bullet, this is the solution, things are too complex, you don't even have to worry about lifestyle, let's not talk about diet, here's an injection. I'm against that. So I'm against taking them as the solution and seeing a tree and missing the forest being lifestyle. That still needs to be at the forefront of the conversation, but I don't think it's productive to say, be dogmatic, only lifestyle, and if you take an injection or pill, you're cheating, because we live in a complex ecosystem filled with food and lifestyle booby traps. We don't live like our ancestors lived. So I do see it as a useful tool for some people. I'm not against them. I just think they need to be put in the right context and used for the right reasons.
What is the lifestyle that we should all be living?
Depends on your needs. So I I have an article coming out. I write these little nuance nibbles. So my newsletter, Stay Curious Metabolism, you can see it at staycuriousmetabolism.com. I usually have long breakdowns, but every now and then I have a thought. So I put up what I call a nuance nibble. And the topic of one upcoming nuance nibble is the limitations of ancestral principles. And I really want to double click on this because I think a lot of people in the low carb, ketogenic, carnivore community go to this idea of live like our ancestors. It's an okay heuristic, but the heuristic breaks down because guess what? Evolution did not optimize for the outcomes we care about now. Evolution did not optimize for your health span to extend to 90 plus years. We have a different ecosystem now. We have different priorities. Evolutionarily, if you popped out 12 kids and dropped dead of a heart attack at 45, you're way fitter than somebody who lived healthy until 90 but only had 2 kids. So our priorities now are different. And I think we need to take that into account because that reframes, I think, this whole idea of an ancestral principle. It's a fine baseline. Like, it's fine to extrapolate from that. Yeah, we probably shouldn't be slamming donuts and eating sugar and being sedentary. I agree with that. But I just want to highlight that there are limitations. Now, with that in mind, your question, what should we each do? Depends on our starting point, depends on our sensitivities, depends on our priorities. Now, that's not a satisfying answer, but I want people to sit with that because there's a drive in all of us to have this simple answer. Tell me what to do. What is the unifying theory? And often there isn't one. And if you can immerse in the fact that the answer is always going to be complex and contextual to you, and then you can engage in the process of finding out, okay, what's unique about what are my needs? It's that process that will lead you to your best health. So I'm intentionally not going to give a straightforward answer to your question because I fundamentally do not believe there is a straightforward answer.
Is there something we should all eat and or not eat? And it may be a thought on how often and how much. Because I think one of the biggest problems is we just eat too often and too much because we have too much access. And that may be one of our biggest problems. But, it's like, what should you eat? Should you not eat? Is there some advice there?
Yeah. I mean, again, so I have my scientist hat and then I have my average Joe hat. And if I put my average Joe hat on, we can work with some heuristics. They're not perfect, but the ideas of, eat foods that are ingredients themselves, not foods that have ingredient lists. Give your digestive tract a rest. Only eat in an 8-hour window or maybe a 10-hour window. Don't eat 15 hours a day and 7 meals a day. At least not for health. Now, if you're like a strong man trying to balloon up to 450 pounds, that's another question. But we can work with those heuristics. And I think that's fine. I'm not going to say anything new to your audience. Yes, you want to get sleep. Yes, you want to avoid processed food, XX sugar, yada, yada, yada. We can dissect all that. I don't think that's necessarily interesting. And I don't think that I'm going to say anything that your audience hasn't heard before. I guess where I would push them is also to think about where these heuristics break down. So I'll give you an example because I always like to make things more complicated. By the way, if people don't like the complicated, don't follow me. Just don't. I'm not your guy.
But this is entertainment. We want to hear the average Joe Nick Norwitz's story and the PhD.
All right. So all right. Then let me give you an example. Let's use seed oils. It's a very controversial subject. So I'm going to give you the average Joe answer, and then I'm going to give you the PhD answer. Average Joe answer: industrialized, highly processed seed oils. Precautionary principle and common sense says avoid them. You can find something better. Simple? Easy?
Simple.
All right. PhD hat on now. And what are we talking about when we're talking about seed oils? I want to operationalize that PhD word. Meaning, let's really define what we're talking about and not use hand-wavy terms. Now, people talk about seed oils as these highly industrialized oils, but then there's this logic creep. Talk about omega-6 fats. So now when I'm talking about seed oils, I'm going to kind of adopt the mindset of what I think a lot of people are thinking about, which are fats that are rich in omega-6. And the focus becomes on this omega-6, in particular linoleic acid. Maybe it's something people have heard about. And so people get into this mindset of seed oils bad, omega-6 bad, inflammatory, reduce it. And this is where I think people fall into a trap. Because yes, I think if you have, a heated, oxidized oil that is, been put in a plastic bottle and sitting on a shelf, again, you can probably do better. But it's not then appropriate to extrapolate, this omega-6 fat is necessarily bad for you. And when you start to look at the literature, it's a lot more complex. There are signs that higher levels of omega-6 in the body might even be good for you. And so how do we make sense of that? I won't go through all the data, but let's just say there are conflicting data. And yes, you can cherry pick data from one side or another and make your case, but let's sit with the conflicting data and say, how can we work this out? Now, the simple answer to that is you are not what you eat. People say you are what you eat. You're not what you eat. You are what your body does with what you eat. And your individual context really matters on that. So I will get into specifics. Take omega-6 fat, there's linoleic acid. You eat it. What happens to it? There are so many things your body can do with it. It can oxidize it. It can put it onto lipoprotein particles. It can contribute to cardiovascular disease. It can turn it into certain harmful byproducts like 4-HNE, which also promote chronic disease, or it can turn it into ketone bodies. It can turn it into oxylipid molecules that actually help protect against perivascular fibrosis and cardiac aging. And what your body ends up doing with that fatty acid, that molecule, that information, that linoleic acid, omega-6, depends on your context. If you're sedentary, have obesity and diabetes, your metabolic milieu is going to steer it more towards the harmful pathways. If you're lean, active, and keto, and young, then guess what? You're going to use that fatty acid very differently. A lot more of it's going to be partitioned into generating molecules, say one's called 12-13-dihome, made in brown and beige fat, that like anti-ages your heart. Or if you're ketogenic, linoleic acid can be a very ketogenic fatty acid. It can boost your ketone levels. So what you have in this starting molecule is an ingredient that your body is going to use in many different ways, depending on you as an individual. And so I want people, they might have to listen back, but again, listen to those two different frameworks. There's the heuristic, the average Joe hat. Yes, highly processed industrialized seed oil with oxidized fats, probably shouldn't eat it. And then there's but let's talk about the compound at the root of it, the omega-6, and say if you eat it in like a raw form, like walnuts, what can your body do with it and what influences how your body uses it? So for example, if you have cold exposure, it actually turns some of the omega-6 fat into this compound I mentioned that anti-ages your heart. There are human data on this. The exact proportion of ingested, I'm not going to have a number for that, but like there are interventions that you can undertake in context that really shapes how any given food interacts with you. And I find that so fascinating.
Is there a therapeutic eating habit that you think we can utilize and follow that may be helping and healing us in general? And you mentioned the linoleic acid, and let's just take, like, is olive oil or some seed oils better for you, the cold pressed oils versus those that are heated in their manufacturing?
Yeah, I would say on balance, the cold pressed oils are going to be healthier for you. In terms of an overall healing diet, it depends on what your use case is. Like, what are you trying to treat? I can't say there's one answer for all diseases.
Let's just talk about metabolic disorders, because we know, heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, and many others, and our metabolic disorders.
Yeah.
Because I was a nutritional biochemistry major in undergrad, and I could tell you what I was taught wasn't what we're talking about sort of today. But I do believe that there's science that we're learning that there are some therapeutic eating habits that help many people with the diseases that you and I are seeing and taking care of. And would you say, you mentioned a low carbohydrate diet, which I believe is truly a high fat diet. And I just focus on what I think is the most important part of it. But, that's the beauty, is we have different approaches to the same goal. And for those listening, because everyone's inspired by what you have to share, and we want to help those, because I do believe the modern medical system is failing us. And we have some work to do with people like yourself there that's challenging it. But what is an average Jane or Joe out there listening going to say, hey, Dr. Norwitz, Dr. Kiltz, is there something I can do nutritionally that's not going to require another pill or dissection?
You know where my bias lands. It's going to probably be in similar direction as you, which is carbohydrate restriction. Whole foods, low carbohydrate, high fat diet, I think would, for most people with metabolic health disorders, metabolic syndrome, spectrum, obesity, diabetes, I think it has the highest chance of improving your lot for most people. That,
And
you want my one liner, that's my answer.
Okay, so I'm in the market, pushing the cart. What would Nick Norwitz fill his cart with?
What would I fill my cart with? High quality extra virgin olive oil. And when I say high quality, a few things to look for that would be, dark glass or metal bottle, harvest date, or press date within the last kind of 2 years. It's going to be a little bit more on the pricey side. Cooking fats, so maybe some ghee, so clarified butter, better for cooking even than butter as a side point. It has, I think the smoke point of ghee is well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit more than butter, because they remove the water and the milk solids, which are some of the things that lead it to, smoke point. So that is a cooking fat. I like coconut oil as well. Olives, and cheeses. I love cheese, and I think it's perfectly healthy. So lots of cheeses. It's probably most of my grocery budget, honestly. And then, nutrient-dense animal proteins. So fatty seafood, wild sockeye salmon is a go-to. Shellfish, things like mussels, tinned sardines, I think are great. No affiliation, but Wild Planet whole sardines, skin and bone, absolutely delicious. If I'm being lazy, I'll get some Primal Kitchen mayo, avocado oil mayo, and dip them. Great snack. Hard-boiled eggs and eggs. Eat a lot of eggs. A2 cream, which I put in a lot of things. My coffee, my A2, by the way, is the A2 casein. So there are different forms of casein protein in dairy. And A1, which is in cow dairy, can be a little bit more inflammatory. So if you look for things labeled A2, if you have a dairy problem, that might end up treating it a little bit or helping it a little bit. We can talk about the biochemistry there. Other nutrient-dense animal proteins, meat, liver. I really like organ meats, actually. So if I can find some nice heart, I'll get that. I picked up some bone marrow today, which I don't often do, but sometimes do. And Greek yogurt. I mean, those are the things, more or less.
You're a well-read and gaining experience in your place and as a scientist. What are your thoughts on limit red meat because it may cause cancer?
I'm trying to find a polite way to put this other than bullshit.
Fertilizer.
No, in all seriousness, again, I bring it back to context. I've read these anti-red meat studies. I'll actually have a letter coming out on it shortly, and they're all very weak. However, I don't discount that there could be some contribution in some people from, say, iron overload, which just because you eat red meat doesn't mean you have iron overload. So I wouldn't entirely discount that some classes of red meat could increase risk of certain cancers like colon cancer. So highly processed meats, processed red meats, I entertain that is a possibility. I don't know how potent they actually are, but I think the literature on balance is very muddied by several things. One, when you're looking at the epidemiology, there's often gross levels of healthy user bias, which, they can say they account for, they never really fully account for it. You can't assume that. Lumping. So when you lump, processed deli sandwiches with a nice grass-fed, grass-finished steak, those are very different things. Metabolic context again. So, that same meat, that same steak, if you eat it with a side of mashed potatoes or fries and you have obesity and you're sedentary, it's very different than if you have steak and broccoli and you're an active, healthy, lean person. Those are different contexts. So I'm not ruling out the possibility that some red meat in some contexts, or say if you overcook it and generate a bunch of exogenous advanced glycation end products, could be a little bit carcinogenic. I just don't think it's a low-hanging fruit. And I'd also entertain that one could very well make an argument that certain elements of animal foods are anti-carcinogenic. So as an example, there are data showing, actually I have a video out about this in which I consult a Harvard MD PhD who has an expertise in gastrointestinal cancers. There was a study showing that carbohydrate restriction in ketogenic diets actually increased the production of stearic acid, which is a saturated fat, in the microbiome. This was done in mice, but it slowed colon tumor progression and growth. Fewer tumors, smaller tumors. And they actually showed that treating with exogenous stearic acid, so that's basically, having tallow or cocoa butter or stearic acid rich foods could also slow tumor growth. So then you're like, okay, this is a predominant fatty acid in a lot of animal fats. In fact, steer, I think the etymology comes from, I think it's the Greek for like steer, like basically like cattle, bison. The origin of the word comes from, or maybe it's tallow comes from steer. I don't know. I'm messing up the etymology. Yep. Bottom line is
beef.
That's not the point. The point is one can make arguments in either direction for red meat being carcinogenic or anti-carcinogenic, depending on context. But I am not sold on the literature that red meat is on net bad or increases your risk of cancer, especially if it's like, eaten in a whole food context. Spam.
Are more people allergic to red meat or fish?
I would guess fish. I mean, you can have like alpha-gal, right? You can have a red meat allergy, but I think a fish allergy would be more common. Definitely shellfish allergies are more common. I don't know the statistics, but if you're talking actual allergies.
Right. And so isn't inflammation essentially an allergic reaction?
No. I mean, it depends how you define allergic.
Swelling.
I would say
an allergic reaction, redness, swelling, pain, heat, dysfunction, damage, death. So the actual allergic reaction, and it's quite likely or possible, many of the diseases are essentially repeated exposures to allergens that we don't see on the outside, but happen on the inside.
It depends how you define allergy. I mean, formally, I'm thinking of like an IgE response.
Yeah, but we're not talking about a laboratory. We're talking about, I just got bit by a bug yesterday, and it's red, swollen, and hot, and it hurts.
That's an inflammatory response, though. That's a broader category.
Right, but it's an allergic response to some allergen, which is an antigen, which our body reacts against because it's a foreign particle. I'm giving you my definition, which I think we're missing because we try to stick to the standard story. But again, I'm just telling you the way I sort of play it out. And I believe because we make complicated stories out of simple science, where really what most of us need is a simplicity, Occam's razor. And it's like, okay, which would you rather, raw milk or pasteurized milk? Is there a difference, do you think, and one's better than the other?
I haven't really delved into the raw versus pasteurized milk debate, so I'm going to defer on that question because I just don't have the information to give an educated answer.
Okay, then we just touched about alpha-gal. What's your thoughts on the story about alpha-gal and meat allergies? Any
Do I have a reason to think that it's not a legitimate phenomenon?
No. What are your thoughts on it? And I mean, I believe it's real because we could be allergic to anything. We're seeing an upswing in those that supposedly have been bitten by a tick, and it's not just the Lone Star tick; it could be others. Are we seeing differences in the meat we're eating today, or is it just one of those things that it's in the lexicon of the stories we're hearing, and so we tend to report the things? It's a reporting bias, maybe.
I think if I had to choose between those two options, I would probably go with the latter. It seems like you're implying maybe that there's a difference in the quality of meat that could be creating an immune trigger, which I wouldn't rule out entirely, but I think probably less likely. I haven't seen compelling literature on like grain-fed versus grass-fed beef actually having differential health effects. I know that's kind of a controversial topic, and for ethical reasons, I choose to have like grass-fed, grass-finished if I can. But in terms of the actual health effects, I haven't seen anything super compelling.
So Nick Norwitz's answer about grain-finished versus grass-finished is there's not enough data to say there's likely a difference, but we don't know that yet.
I don't think there's much of a difference, if any. I mean, if you go and look at like, okay, what is the exact fatty acid profile? Maybe you can find like a smidgen of difference, but like anything that's clinically meaningful, I haven't seen anything.
Are we addicted to food as part of the pathology? And, you have a food addiction.
Yeah.
And I always wondered, like, if you're an alcoholic or a drug addict and you live in a drug den or alcohol den,
Yeah.
the Chinese were gifted opium from the English, and it propagated a tremendous amount of opium addiction. So is part of our problem the environment and the recommendations? The American College of OBGYN recommends a plant-based, low-fat diet and red wine for pregnant lactating women. Is it
Really?
possible? Oh, yeah. Look at the 3 years ago, there's an expert opinion out on pregnant lactating women's diet. Mediterranean, lean meat, and the fat was from avocado, not even from meat, and red wine was recommended.
I have a expert OBGYN in my family. I'll have to go ask them.
I can get you just look up expert opinion by ACOG on a diet for healthy in women. And I have no reason to be biased for or against it. My job is alcohol.
Go ahead.
Is alcohol good for us?
No. I don't know. I really don't think it is. I don't think anybody argue it. I think it's pretty it's becoming common knowledge that no amount of alcohol is actually healthy. I'm not saying if you have one glass of wine on a Friday, it's going to be like the end of the world. But I think the opinion is definitely shifting that no amount of alcohol is actually healthy.
If Nick Norwitz could change our medical education and or the practice of medicine, what would he do?
That's a difficult question. I mean, there's a lot of things I would do. I think it would be difficult to execute, but having a whole year of medical school devoted to studying metabolic health. Like, I know, having gone just through a medical curriculum, how jam-packed it is, and often, things are being chopped to make place for other things. I think metabolic health deserves a full year, a full 1/4 of the curriculum. And I think that can come in lots of different forms. But I also really encourage this, if you want my hot take, I don't know if we'd actually get this in, but that it will be mandated that medical trainees have experience with metabolic health interventions. That means you have to go through labs, quote unquote, where unless you have a medical contraindication, try intermittent fasting, different types of diets, wear continuous glucose monitors. At kind of a sidebar, we actually did this. I did this with my peers my first year at Harvard Med, where I gave everybody CGMs, Dexcoms, and they just wore them. And we used it as a medical education tool. This was totally just elective, voluntary. Students loved it, learned so much, got so much insight. So I do think, incorporating that early on into medical education with a lot of immersion and discussion, journal clubs around breaking metabolic health insights would give people the framework to practice better clinical medicine in the ecosystem we have. That would be my take.
Now, you were accepted to a university and then to a PhD MD program, and you have had access to immense knowledge that when I was in my undergrad, medical school, residency, fellowship, nobody had access to this unless you were accepted to these places. Today, it's all right here.
Yeah.
And is it important, do you think, is open up more medical knowledge access to everybody to give them the power of knowledge to their healthcare system and their healthcare themselves?
Well, the easy answer is yes, of course. Maybe the more important answer is it doesn't even matter what my opinion is because it's happening anyway. And I think that's a fantastic thing. I think that is one of the greatest opportunities of our time in healthcare. It's that given social media and access to information and freedom of speech, which obviously all have their, flip side of the coin, their downsides, but people have the power in their hands. They can get access to the data and discussions and the insights that allow them to really take the helm of their own health ship, empower them. Now, it's not always easy because there's so much information, it can be, a flood. But yeah, people have access to the scientific paper. People have access to people online giving different opinions, and you can really explore your health and metabolic health worlds and be a champion of that. I think it's very empowering. And rather than looking at your healthcare provider as the source of truth and some omniscient being seeing them as they should be seen, which is as your support, your partner with you in control. So we talked at the beginning of this conversation about standard of care. There are reasons it's really hard to shift standard of care. I'm not going to say whether that's right or wrong. What I will say is any individual can do whatever the heck they want with their lifestyle. And if you go to your clinician, and I'm not saying do this, I'm saying this, actually, I'll just say what I did. I said, look, I'm doing a ketogenic diet. It's working amazingly for me. Here are my concerns and considerations. I would like your help in these ways. Can you support me? I didn't say, and I'm not saying you should say this, I'm just saying I didn't go and plead for them to prescribe X, Y, and Z. It's like, look, I'm an adult. Now I have, scientific training, but any adult can just be like, I'm an adult and I've made a decision. I would like your support with this. Can you help me? Because I respect your input. And then have a collaborative discussion with their healthcare provider. So the idea, the truth that people have this information at their fingertips in the phone that you just held up and waved, I think is incredibly empowering. And people should take that power to heart. That, yeah, you can change your life. It doesn't mean you should abandon, conventional medicine and your doctor, but you should just say, look, they're not the source of truth. They're my support. I'm going to them to support me on my health journey. What do you want that to look like? That is up to you.
The hierarchy of medicine has been doctor over patient. And I think we need to switch it around because we work for the patient and we're consultant. And I think that's much of what you're saying is get a chance to talk to them and find the one that's going to work with you where you want to go, not just where they want to go in all this.
Yeah. Shop around. You can get a second opinion. You can abandon your doctor. You can fire your doctor. You have that right. Go for it. If they don't work with you, and it's not saying they're even a bad doctor. It's just a bad fit. If you date someone and it falls apart, it doesn't mean they're a bad person or you're a bad person. It's just not a good fit. So doctor-patient, it's the same thing. You need to find the right fit. And everybody deserves that. Now,
there's a lot of people with elevated cholesterol and LDL and all those sort of things. And one of my favorite snacks, well, I probably ate them every day, was Oreo cookies.
Oh, yeah.
Can you just give us the 1 minute story on the importance of Oreo cookies in your health and wellness?
Yes. Disclaimer or caveat, I was never paid by Oreo or any big food company to do this experiment. But when we were early on in our research around lean mass hyperresponders, so people who go low carb and see their LDL skyrocket, I won't get into the whole mechanism. It's not pertinent to the takeaway of the story. But bottom line was this was an incredibly fascinating area of science and medicine. And I thought this deserves to be explored. This needs attention. And despite pumping out papers, we had 9 or 10 at the time, including meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. So talk about hierarchy of evidence. We're sitting on the top of that pyramid. People don't talk about it. And they're not talking about it, again, because of, I think, the incentive structures. I won't go back to that. But that just, this wasn't in the scope of curiosity because it wasn't in the conventional framework. And that ticked me off. It ticked me off that I'm like, this is incredible. I'm not saying me, but this could be the basis of a Nobel Prize someday. This is a phenomenal group of patients. I happen to be one of those patients, in that population. That is the exception that could prove the new rule. We have so much about cardiology and lipidology we could learn from these patients, their weird lipid dynamics. Why is nobody paying attention to this? And so, I had barely any media presence at that time, 5,000 followers on Twitter or something. And I don't have a lot of money. So what can I do to get attention? And I'm like, what I do have, a little bit cheeky. I have a doctorate. I'm at Harvard, so I have branding. Can I design a stunt? And let me be clear, this was intended to be a stunt to draw attention to this phenomenon. And so I came up with the Oreo versus statin experiment because I thought, understanding the physiology as I did, I could develop a metabolic context where I could eat Oreo cookies and use them to lower my cholesterol. But not just I'm going to do this and say I did it and put it up in a blog. No. I know how to dot my I's and cross my T's because I'm a cheeky little academic. So what I did was I designed a protocol. I got a very senior lipidologist, his name is Professor William Cromwell, maybe people know him, to consult, help me design the study. I have my primary care clinician ordering all my labs. I went to Harvard's Institutional Review Board and said, hey, I'm doing this. I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to do it. Please know that I'm going to do this. Please grant me an IRB exemption letter. Did it all right. Then I did the experiment and was able to show in a crossover study, so an Oreo intervention, washout period, statin intervention, high dose statin, 20 milligrams of Crestor for 6 weeks, that the Oreos were better, actually more than twice as powerful at lowering my cholesterol, my LDL cholesterol, as a statin. Then we published the paper. So bottom line is, yes, I did an experiment where I used Oreo cookies to lower my cholesterol more powerfully than the most profitable drug class in history. And that achieved the aim I set out to achieve, got people talking. And, it started a conversation with academics, with clinicians, among the general population. And the conversation was not, Oreos are good for you. The conversation is, oh, wow, this is interesting. Why did this happen? Let's talk about it more. So those were the discussions we have. And I like to highlight that example. And I'm grateful the stunt went off so well, because it plays into this idea that we've been talking about of, incentive structures. Like, what gets attention? What do I need to do to steer the conversation the way I want to steer it? I don't have Pfizer money, so you need to do other things. And I always want people to come back when they're digesting media, be it information from me, you, legacy media, healthcare media. What are the incentive structures driving this? It'll often give people a lot of insight. And so, sometimes things come off as clickbaity, because guess what? Engagement is a currency, and you kind of have to pay homage to that altar. And then the question really is like, well, what is the depth? Is there value add here? Is this something that makes you think and evolves your perspective? Is the person talking actually willing to engage you with an open mind? In the end, it's up to the individual to decide if the message being propagated is valuable. But yes, I lowered my cholesterol with Oreo cookies. Yes, it was a clickbait stunt. That was the intention. And it was incredibly successful in its aim to bring attention to a fascinating corner of lipidology that deserves more attention. And now it's getting it.
So by doing that and lowering your LDL cholesterol, do you think you lowered your risk of heart disease?
I'm not going to answer that question, because I think that's the provocative element of the intervention. Because here's the thing. I know when that headline runs, people want to resolve an implicit tension. Oreos, healthy or unhealthy? I think we all agree they're unhealthy. Lowering LDL, conventionally thought of as healthy. So unhealthy intervention, quote unquote, healthy outcome, those things butt heads. They're a paradox. And if there's a paradox, it means there's something we don't understand. That was the point. The point was to create that cognitive dissonance, not to solve it for people, but say, hey, this is weird. We need to study this.
How many cookies a day did you have?
12.
12 cookies a day. Had you just done one cookie a day, might you have had the same outcome?
No, I think.
Well, we don't know that. We don't know that. I mean, I'm right. So, I mean, we don't know that. You're suspecting it wouldn't be, but I guess I'm always wondering, how does LDL cholesterol cause heart disease?
I mean, the conventional perspective is the response to retention model, lipid heart hypothesis. So loss of LDL gets into the artery wall, causes inflammation, plaque grows. It's the conventional model.
That's a theory, correct?
Yeah, it's a theory.
Right. So hypothesis, theory, and much of science and medicine works on theories. And I'm just curious about your storytelling and how storytelling may change the paradigm of science.
Yeah. Well, I think models need evolution. And so this idea that high LDL will just cause heart disease, almost like high LDL is the disease, is overly simplistic, and the current lipid heart hypothesis is not a complete model. That's not to say it's wrong per se, it's just not complete. And we know this because we have people who buck the system. I have a family member with an LDL of over 400 who happens to be in her 60s and has had high LDL her whole life. And on coronary CT angiography, her arteries are crystal clear. That does not align with the current paradigm. Now, you could just wave your hands and say, oh, that's a fluke, that's a one-off. I'm like, so what? It doesn't matter. The outliers are the ones we need to study to understand the mechanism better. So it's not so the hot take, that's not at all a hot take. The most controversial thing I can say that's not at all controversial in cardiology is different people have a different relationship between LDL and ApoB exposure and plaque progression. That's known. The same amount of ApoB LDL exposure does not convert to the same amount of plaque in different people. So the question is, Why? That's, we could have a conversation for 4 hours about that. But I think, the high level, which we both agree on, is metabolic context of the individual matters. And if we're broadening this, you always, without, I think, singular exception, need to look at a given marker in context. Any good endocrinologist, so hormone doctor, will tell you there's actually no normal lab. There's just appropriate or inappropriate for the context. So what is the context? What are the other lab markers? What is the patient's history? What is their diet and lifestyle? Context always matters.
Bile acids and depression. 30 seconds.
30
or
seconds.
a minute.
All right. So bile acids are things that our bodies produces. People think of them as just helping to digest fat. The high level is bile acids, especially those that are modified by our microbiome, so-called secondary bile acids. They're hormones. So you think of your gut as an endocrine organ. It spits out hormones, in part these secondary bile acids, that go all over your body and do crazy things. They can cause or protect you from heart disease. They can cross the blood-brain barrier and bind to receptors, one's called TGR5, to influence depression. So the high level is, what you eat affects your microbiome, the metabolites it produces, the hormones that it produces to affect your heart, to affect your brain, to affect your mind. That's the high level.
One dietary myth you wish would die.
Extreme diets are bad.
Finishing up here, what's your most important bit of advice for all of us listening today from Nick Norwitz, MD, PhD?
I have a long sleeve shirt on. I'm trying to get it on my arm. It is my mantra. It is what I live by. It is my only tattoo. Stay curious. That really is my best advice. And what I want to clarify what that means to me. It means find the awe and the joy in your exploration of the natural world, starting with your own physiology. Because guess what? If you don't do that, you're going to get incredibly confused and frustrated and probably give up. But if you can see different people's perspectives, find them interesting and curious, and then continuously explore and experiment with your own body and your own lifestyle interventions, not only do I promise, if you adopt this approach, you will continue to get healthier, but you're going to have a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So that's my advice. Stay curious.
Joy. Dr. Nick Norwitz, MD, PhD, it's really been spectacular having you on today. And for those that want to stay curious, how do they find you? What should they listen and look for?
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. You're a very gracious host. I'm Nick Norwitz, last name Norwitz on all social media, YouTube, X, Instagram, etc. And if you want the latest breaking in new metabolic health science, my newsletter is on Substack, Stay Curious Metabolism. So you can go to staycuriousmetabolism, all one word.com. I pop out at least 3 new newsletters per week. We coming up on like mitochondrial transplants, the 2 peaks of aging, things made by your gut microbiome that can be antidepressants, how your diet in fact impacts your offspring, whatever is interesting and new in science, autophagy, depression, whatever, I'm going to cover it. I wake up at 4 a.m. because I have insomnia. I read Nature, Cell Science, and then I love to write. So staycuriousmetabolism.com is probably where I direct people first, and then any social media. But thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated the discussion.
Nick, it was really a pleasure. God bless you, and we'll keep following, listening, and learning together. Thank you, everyone, and stay curious with Dr. Rob Kiltz and Carnivore Conversations, where you could meet the Stay Curious MD, PhD Nick Norwitz. God bless everyone. Take care.